Hey everyone! Today I want to introduce you to the concept of a sociolect. Simply put, a sociolect is a variety of language used by a particular social group. Unlike regional dialects, which are tied to geography, land, location, region, sociolects are tied to our social identities. The word sociolect comes from a combination of two words, social and dialect. It's a blended word that literally means social dialect. So, a way of speaking that reflects the social group or groups that you belong to. Sociolects can be influenced by a variety of groups, including your social class, so whether you're working class or maybe middle class, your age, so whether you're a child, maybe you're a teen or an adult, your gender and your sexuality, your profession or your occupation, so think doctors versus lawyers versus teachers, right? Your education level, whether you receive like formal versus informal schooling, your ethnic or cultural groups, which we can also call ethnolects. These are language patterns tied to your heritage. And then peer and interest groups, so friends or cliques. Think interest groups like gamers, skateboarders, K-pop fans, sports fans, groups that build identity partly through like having a shared way of speaking, right? So this isn't a full list, but notice how none of these have to deal with location. So a geographical location, which is what makes a sociolect different from a regional dialect. So a sociolect is how your identity shapes the way you speak, how your gender, your age, your education, your occupation, all these things shape the way that you use language. When we talk about dialects, whether we're talking about regional dialects or sociolects, we're really analyzing language using the same three key features, so accent, lexicon, and grammar. These features help us see how a group's way of speaking is distinct from other groups, right? So accent refers to the way words are pronounced. That's the most simple way to define that. Lexicon is like the vocabulary a group uses, so the words a group uses, because different social groups often have words or expressions that are unique to them. And grammar involves the structures and the rules people use when like forming sentences, right? So by looking at these three features, we can begin to understand how regional dialects and sociolects, we can understand them both like in a systematic way. So let's look at a few examples of how each of these meets some of the different social groups that we talked about. Let's start with accent, which refers to, again, simply put, the way we pronounce words. Sociolects often have accents that signal social groups that's different than how like a regional dialect might work, right? So the youth, if you look at like youth in the college age as an example, among late teens and early college students in the US, you might notice a tendency to use a vocal fry or what's called uptalk, ending statements with a rising intonation, especially in casual conversations. So this can signal belonging to a certain peer or social group, right? Using these accent features. When we look at ethnic identity, if we want to look at African American English, for example, among African American communities across the US, you might notice accent features such as reducing the diphthong in words, like time becomes tam. These features function as identity markers and signal belonging to a shared culture and social community, right? Gender and sexuality, so looking at LGBTQ+, among some gay men in the US, you might notice clearer articulation or a distinct pronunciation of S sounds. And these accentual features can serve as social signals marking affiliation with LGBTQ+ identity and community. So these are examples of how accent, even subtle pronunciation features, can mark social identity. Let's now look at lexicon. Again, lexicon refers to the words or the vocabulary that a social group uses. So different groups often develop words or phrases that are unique to them, helping to signal identity and membership to those groups. So let's talk about professional jargon. If you look at lawyers, you'll notice specialized vocabulary, specialized language, such as words like plaintiff, brief, or due diligence, right? These words are part of the legal profession's sociolect, and they function as markers of expertise and belonging in that professional community. Looking at the youth and college age again, among teens and college students, you'll often hear slang terms like lit, maybe meaning exciting, right? Or low key, which can mean secretly, using the abbreviation or the acronym FR, meaning for real, or cap or no cap, meaning lying, not lying. So using these words signals group membership and helps maintain like a shared peer identity, right? Interest-based groups like gamers in online gaming communities, players use words like nerf to mean weaken, or buff to mean straighten, AFK to mean away from keyboard. And these terms make communication more efficient, but also serve as in-group markers of gamer identity. So lexicon shows how the words we choose can reveal the social groups that we belong to. But now let's talk finally about grammar, some grammar examples from different sociolects. We talk about class, right? So in some working class varieties of British English, I know most of my examples deal with the US, and they all deal with English because it's the only language I speak. You might hear, so in working class varieties of British English, you might hear double negatives, such as I haven't got none, instead of the standard I don't have any, or I do not have any. And we can see some of that class variety also in the US, right? If we talk about youth speakers again, younger speakers often simplify grammar, especially in casual settings. So for example, they may drop auxiliary verbs and say things like he funny instead of he is funny. In texting or in quick conversations, they might omit like subject pronouns. So saying things like got homework instead of do you have homework? And they also frequently use discourse markers like or literally to shape storytelling or emphasis. So things like, I was like so tired, right? If we talk about like the professional and academic context. So academic and professional settings call for more complex and formal grammar. You'll often see longer or carefully structured sentences like, given the results of the experiment, it is evident that the hypothesis is supported. And this precise tense use and formal grammar choices, they usually signal professionalism and expertise in these contexts, right? So grammar, one thing I want to hit home here with is that grammar in any case, in sociolects or regional dialects, whatever, that it's not random. It reflects social group conventions, peer norms, professional expertise, and it's governed by rules and systems like any standard language would be, right? When we talk about social groups as being like distinct dialects, right, we're looking at the ways these social groups differ in accent and lexicon and in their grammars as well. Now, when we talk about sociolects, there are a lot of common misconceptions that can confuse people, so let's clear a few of those up. It's easy to assume that only lower class groups have distinct ways of speaking, right? But every social group, whether defined by age or profession, education, ethnicity, or peer group, can develop its own sociolect. Lawyers, gamers, teenagers, they all have their own linguistic patterns, right? Despite whether they're middle class, working class, upper class, it doesn't matter. Every class, every sociolect has its own linguistic patterns. Another misconception might be that everyone in a social group speaks the same way. Sociolects don't mean everyone in a group sounds identical, right? The research here reflects trends or patterns, but individual variation definitely exists amongst people, even in the same social group. Another misconception might be that sociolects reflect intelligence or ability. Some people wrongly assume that maybe non-standard sociolects indicate lower intelligence, right? So in reality, sociolects are really about identity, culture, and social context, not cognitive ability. And sociolects, they do change over time, especially with social trends and technology, teen slang, gamer language, professional jargon. These things all evolve very rapidly. Finally, possibly one of the biggest misconceptions is that some people think if someone speaks in a sociolect, they're speaking incorrectly, right? They think that it's incorrect or it's just slang. And in reality, sociolects, like regional dialects, right? All these dialects, they are systematic, rule-governed varieties of language, just like any other form of speech. So all of these are common misconceptions about sociolects, the way different social groups speak, right? And this brings us to an important point. When we as linguists say things like, well, this age group tends to talk like this, or this gender tends to talk like this, we're not just making casual observations or assumptions. We're conducting real systematic research to identify these patterns. The things we find may not, as I said above, or just a minute ago, may not apply to everyone in that social group, but by and large may describe the majority in that group. And so while mainstream society often makes assumptions about how different social groups speak, these perceptions aren't always accurate. So as linguists, we approach these questions with rigorous methods to uncover the complexities of these different language varieties. And so we're going to talk about several classic studies and how they've kind of shaped and set a foundation for how we understand some of these sociolects. So starting with Bernstein, in 1971, Bernstein wanted to understand how social class, so how a culmination of things like income, family, parent education, how these things influence the way people speak. And what he noticed was that people from different social class backgrounds often use language in distinct ways, which he called restricted and elaborated codes. So starting first with restricted codes. This style uses shorter sentences, fewer details, and really relies heavily on shared context. So for instance, someone might just say, gonna be late, don't wait. Everyone involved then understands the situation without needing explanation or any extra explanation. So Bernstein found that this was common actually in working class families where people share experiences and assumptions. So that's restricted code. Let's talk about elaborated code. And these elaborated code is more detailed. So sentences are longer, explanations are explicit, and the speaker doesn't assume the listener shares the same context. So for example, I will be late to the meeting because the bus is delayed, so please start without me. And this style, what he found was more common among middle-class families, where language often needed to clearly convey more information to someone who might not share the same background. So how did he figure this out, right? What was his method? So what he did was he observed children in different schools and their families, paying really close attention to how they described everyday events and situations. And by analyzing these conversations, by analyzing these patterns, basically, he saw clear connections between social class and the way children structured their language. So what he argued was that social class shapes access to these codes. So access to whether the restricted code or the elaborated code. And the implication of these differences played out in school with these children. So middle class children often came to school already using elaborated code, which benefited them because that aligned with how teachers and textbooks communicate, right? Whereas the working class children used the restricted code more often, which put them at a disadvantage in school where the elaborated code was expected. So it's important to emphasize, I want to take a moment to emphasize that the restricted code is not inferior to the elaborated code. It's simply different and works perfectly well in the context where it's used. The key takeaway from this study is that social class shapes language use. And it's really showing how grammar and discourse are used differently but correctly by different social groups. Another classic study is that of William Labov, who wanted to see also how social class influences language use, but specifically pronunciation. So the last study looked at grammar and discourse. This one looked at pronunciation. And earlier we called pronunciation accent, right? So one of his famous studies, and he had many studies, but this is one of the most famous ones, looked at the pronunciation of the post-vocalic R, so The R at the end of syllables like car, floor, right? You're hearing that sound. So he conducted his study in 3 New York City department stores that catered to different social classes. Saks, which was catered to high-end upper-class customers. Macy's was catered to mid-range middle-class customers. And then S. Klein, which I don't believe is in business anymore, but that catered to more the low-end working-class customers. So Labov asked employees questions that naturally included sounds, such as which floor would I find the lamps? And so he knew the answer what was the 4th floor. So he would ask this question knowing it would prompt the clerks to say 4th floor, right? And you're hearing that both of those words have the sound in it. So he also observed how they casually spoke to customers. So he's primarily looking at sales clerks. So what he found was really interesting. Employees at Saks pronounced the more often, the R sound in 4th floor. Macy's employees less so, and the employees at S. Klein pronounced it the least. So what this showed is that pronunciation patterns were not random, they were systematically linked to social class. Labov also noticed something else, that when he would have them repeat the answer, so what floor are the lamps on? The 4th floor, right? I'm trying to drop the R. I don't know if I did a good job. And he said, what floor? That when clerks repeated the answer, 4th floor, they would emphasize the R when they were repeating it, right? And so even those who dropped the R pronunciation more frequently would insert it back in when they had to repeat themselves more carefully. And this demonstrated what we call style shifting, that people unconsciously or consciously adjust their speech depending on the social context and the audience. So the key takeaway from Labov's study is that accent and pronunciation are socially meaningful. The way we speak can signal our social class, and people often adjust their speech to fit a situation. And this study is a classic example of how accent functions in a sociolect, showing that even small features like a single consonant can carry social information. Our last big study I want to look at is by Penelope Eckert, and she studied how high school peer groups develop their own way of speaking. So she focused on 2 main groups, jocks and burnouts. So jocks were students involved in sports and school activities, generally more academic focused, and burnouts were students who were more rebellious and less engaged with school norms. So it's important to note that Eckert didn't assign these labels herself. They came from the students and the data she collected. So what she found was that each group had distinct speech patterns, pronunciation, and vocabulary. For example, the burnouts often used more non-standard grammar like ain't, or dropped the final G sound in words like going. So going, they would say going instead of going. And they also use slang such as chill and dude or whatever. And you can see that the study was in 2000. So I don't know if modern youth are still using those words, but it fits the year 2000. And that the burnouts often, they tend to speak casually and then sometimes dropping like consonant sounds in words. Now, the jocks, in contrast, generally used more standard grammar and clearer enunciation. Their vocabulary included school and sports-related terms like practice, team meeting, or score, and they spoke in a more formal tone. So Eckert spent a full year in a high school observing students in classrooms and hallways and social settings, and she conducted interviews, recorded conversations, and analyzed how language varied between these groups. And the key takeaway from Eckert's study is that teenagers develop peer group sociolects. So our last 2 studies looked at social class, right? This one's looking at age, but also inside the same age, how there's different peer group sociolects. These speech patterns signal belonging, right? They distinguish them from other groups, and they're meaningful indicators of social identity, not random variations. What I wanted to highlight by going through 3 of these studies, because there's tons of studies out there on the sociolects, on these different social groups, is that when linguists approach it, it's done from a research perspective, right? With methodical approach and data collection and analysis. It's not just an observation we note once and spit out there as truth. We conduct real research on it. So to wrap up what we've learned about sociolects, a sociolect is a variety of a language used by a social group reflecting things like social class, age, gender, ethnicity, or peer group, or more. Unlike regional dialects, sociolects are about who you are socially, not just where you're from physically. We've seen that sociolects are made up of three main features: accent, vocabulary, and grammar. And these features aren't random. They follow patterns that linguists can study systematically. Through classic research, we saw Bernstein's elaborated versus restricted codes and Lebov's study on the R pronunciation and Eckert's study on jocks and burnouts. We can see that language is deeply tied to social identity. And my final point is that sociolects are not just about communication. They signal who we are, the groups we belong to, and how we relate to others, and how we want to relate to others, and what groups we want to belong to. So understanding sociolects helps us appreciate the richness and the diversity of language. It reminds us that every way of speaking has meaning and has value.